Okay, to start this one, I want to just prompt you to do something really quick, and you can write this down yourself right now, or you can stop and just do this via the participation activity in Canvas. But before I move on to talk about something else, I want you to just think about if you knew you'd never get caught or no one would ever know that you were doing, the things you were doing, just think of 10 things that you would do if you knew you would never get caught. So pause this, go to Canvas, or just write them down and plan to write them into Canvas later. Think of those 10 things. So I'll stop for just a second and waste time saying words in a slow manner. Okay, and assuming you've done that, next thing I want you to do is think about those things that you wrote down and tell me, how many things out of 10 are antisocial things like selfish or for your own benefits, not for other people. How many things are pro-social, so helping other people in any way, and how many things are just kind of neutral. So take a second to pause and write those things down or finish up in Canvas if you haven't done so already. Okay, and the reason I need to do that is just so we can compare that to some prior data that talks about this. If you ask people to do this in general, they are going to tend to report things that break roughly on these types of lines. Some things are not very easily categorizable, so you might not have all of them, and that's why this doesn't add up to 100%. But if you are not identifiable and people don't know what you're doing frequently, you're going to be kind of selfish. A lot of our motivations to be pro-social are kind of normative things that we are trying to look good and fit in a way that we think is appropriate. So people tend to be either kind of neutral or kind of selfish if they don't think that people can see what they're doing. And if you look at different populations of people like college students and people that are in prison, you don't tend to see big differences. I think this used to be evidence that, like, hey, we all do bad things. We're all maybe even as bad as people in prison. But I think actually what it's probably really evidence of is that people in prison are not different from people that are outside of prison frequently because of the types of quote-unquote criminals that our prisons are filled with. But anyway, I guess I could give you a rant about that on a separate topic. But suffice it to say, this is a pretty generalizable finding that people are going to be more selfish than giving if there's no credit, so to speak. So this has to do with some ideas around something called de-individuation. That if you don't feel like you're identifiable, then you tend to act slightly different. So de-individuation has to do with feeling anonymous and not feeling as much like an individual, basically. And a famous study that looked into this was by something that Ed Diener did with some colleagues in the 70s, his famous trick-or-treating study, where they kind of set up a house, actually a few houses in a neighborhood, I believe, to kind of measure kids' tendencies under different types of conditions. So they wanted to measure, basically, if kids were going to transgress when given some instructions. So outside of these houses, they put a bowl of candy, sorry, there's a typo there, a bowl of candy and a bowl of money, like change, coins. And the children were instructed by the person that answered the door that they could have one piece of candy, so they could take it out of the bowl. But then the person that answered the door had to go deal with a phone call or go do something inside. So they said, hey, I gotta go, take one piece of candy and be on your way, please. So they were told not to take more than one piece of candy and told not to, and they were not told anything about the money, basically. So they just wanted to manipulate some features about the situation to see if people would take too much candy or take money and thus transgress or break the rules. And I talked about de-individuation as being anonymity and reduced individuality, so that's kind of what they manipulated. That or they measured it rather, because on Halloween you have kids that are alone, kids that are by themselves, kids that are in masks, and kids that aren't. So anonymous or not was, do they have a mask on or not? Are they identifiable? And individuality was, are they in a group of kids or are they coming up to the door alone? You know, presumably their parents are walking behind them, but who knows? It's the 70s. People were a little more relaxed with the way that kids did things then. So, mask or not, and in a group or alone that they manipulated. And they just looked at the percentages in these groups of kids that broke the rules. And they found pretty striking results that kids that are alone and not wearing masks, so they're identifiable, you know, you can see them, right? They're going to get blamed. They feel they could get caught for something, or they maybe just feel more like themselves and they want to be responsible or something. But less than 10% of those kids took too much candy or took any of the money. If you added one of those conditions of de-individuation, that they either were anonymous by virtue of having a mask, or they were in a group of kids and felt, you know, less identifiable and individual in that situation, it jumped up to about a fifth of kids. But then if you had both of those conditions, so they're alone and in a mask, so there's very little accountability, there's anonymity, that you, I think I maybe said alone and in a mask. Obviously I meant a group and in a mask, if I misspoke there, sorry about that. But almost 60% of kids, when they were in that group and masked condition, broke the rules. So it doesn't take that much for people to change their behavior, just something about their circumstances. And part of the explanation for this is not just that, you know, kids are feeling like they can break the rules. It's that you just feel less self-awareness in general. You're not as focused on yourself because perhaps you don't have that reflection of other people's attention focusing on you, and you just don't maybe feel like the norms apply to you as much anymore. So I know in the trick-or-treating study this seems kind of silly and frivolous, but this is, you know, how some groups that operate in more hateful ways might give their group members some sort of purchase to act horribly. For example, the Ku Klux Klan. It's not just a funny or silly coincidence that they wear masks. They wear masks and they travel around in groups when doing things. And they, you know, did when they were more around, but they were making a resurgence, terrifyingly. But they wear masks and do things in groups because it is easier for people to do hateful, terrible things if they are under those circumstances. Nobody goes around, committing hate crimes alone when people know who they are. It's only when they are kind of shrouded in this cloak of de-individuation that people do things like this. And, I mean, obviously there's a lot of in-between between trick-or-treating and hate crimes, but de-individuation affects us all to some degree. That people tend to be more impulsive and more likely to break rules when they are de-individuated, probably because there's just a general lack of self-awareness there. So people feel like they aren't as responsible or they won't get in trouble when they are in a crowd. And again, this is like why, you know, people might scream mean things or epithets at players on sports teams, or why riots happen. Like, nobody riots or yells out racial epithets at people by themselves generally, or it's much less common. But in groups, this type of behavior might be more likely because you're not going to be identified, you're not as focused on yourself, you feel like you're part of a bigger organism of that group than of yourself. So you can have some bad consequences of being just in a group again in this sense. Okay, so I've focused a lot in these first few sections about bad outcomes from groups, especially with respect to decision making and behavior with respect to norms. But I do want to mention just one pretty incredible thing about how groups can have some power in some senses. So take a look at this. This is an activity that I did in past semesters. I can't really do it now, obviously, but if you take a look at this jar of red lentils that I put here, I I'm not insane. I didn't actually count all of these lentils. I took a teaspoon, counted how many were in a teaspoon, and then I counted the number of teaspoons that I put in the jar. So I have a very educated estimate of how many lentils are in here, but it would have taken me forever to count all these individual ones. So that's a lot of time for me to devote to trying to prove to you that I'm not insane, which maybe is undermining my point in general. Anyway, let's move on. How many lentils do you think is in this jar? Take a minute to look, make your guess, write it down, try to remember it. I'm not going to have you put this particular thing in Canvas, but just think about it, make sure you have it. So when I've done this in classes before, I'm going to show you one example of how this worked out. That's pretty incredible. My estimate from my multiplication that I did was just over 10,000 lentils. So this is probably not exactly right, obviously, but it's somewhere around here. In a class of 140 students, I asked this same question before, and the student guesses were pretty wide in their range, right? Some students guessed as few as 120, which is incredible because you can see way more than that. And some students guess over 500,000. And that's incredible for its own reason, which seems kind of impossible. But, you know, these are pretty widely ranging guesses, right? And they're not very close in general to the one that I made. In fact, most of them were vast underestimations that almost 90% of people guessed less than 5,000. So they were not close really at all. And even a third of people guessed below 1,000. So people are pretty bad at this, at guessing how many lentils are in this jar. But even though people are all over the place and most of them are pretty wrong, if you take the average number of the guesses that I got in this particular class, you get this, which is amazing and might actually be closer than my estimate. So remember that I'm just doing this based on this multiplication. This might have been almost right. It might have been more right than my estimate. Who knows? But it never ceases to amaze me, no matter how many times I do this or how many times I talk about it, that a class was able to get this close, even though everybody was incredibly far off on their own. So I know this seems, again, kind of silly, but this can generalize to important types of things that people make real decisions about, right? Sometimes groups can make better decisions than people on their own, partly because when people have the opportunity to give their opinions, it can undermine two things that have to do with group things. So in that example, people were giving free input. They didn't feel like anything about the pressure of the group, or it would show something negative about them if they were wrong. Like, everyone gave their own guess and felt like they could be honest with their suggestion. And people had varied perspectives. When I did this, I literally had the jar in front of the class. Some people were close, some people were far, some people are probably good at estimating, some people are probably bad, some people were thinking about it very carefully, some people weren't. There's probably all different kinds of perspectives that are contributing to those guesses. So when you have freedom for people to feel like they can contribute and give their ideas, and when you have lots of different perspectives, that is going to lead to generally better types of deliberation and better consideration of opinions than when you, say, have like one leader that hears an idea and likes it, and then nobody feels like they can go against that person. So this goes beyond lentils. It's for things like, you know, making good public policy, or when people are trying to make deliberations on juries about people's lives, or when people are trying to decide who a leader is going to be. You can have really good group outcomes if you are careful about them and you let people contribute. And this also underscores how important diversity is to good group functioning and group deliberation. If everyone is coming from the same perspective, then you're going to get direction, or you're going to get inputs that are all biased in the same way. But if you get perspectives that are rich and varied and different, then you're going to get people that are helping you think about things that you might not have considered. Okay, so I'm going to stop this one here, and next time we'll kind of move from intra-group to intergroup processes.